Hello and welcome to Focus on Israel, which looks at the Holy Land. I'm Paul Calvert. Psalm 23 verse 4 from the New King James Bible says this: Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me.
I'm with Rabbi Leo Dee. Now, Rabbi Leo, did you always want to be a rabbi?
I started actually as a banker, an investor in private equity. Went to Cambridge University. I was brought up in a not particularly religious home, and that was my trajectory. And then I had a sort of awakening, really from the age of about 17 it started, but I guess when I got married to my wife Lucy in 1997, various things happened that sort of made me realize that this was not my path.
And when did you actually make Aliyah to come to Israel?
So we came in, we got married in 1997, and in 2004 we came to Israel for 4 years for me to retrain as a rabbi. We had we had two girls at the time. We had two more born in Israel, and then my son was born when we came back to England in 2008. And basically we were rabbi and a rabbinical couple for 6 years in England.
And then you came to Israel full time?
And then we came back again in 2014.
Wow. And was this a real eye-opener when you actually came to Israel for the very first time to see what it was like and feel that you're home, you're a Jew and you want to be a rabbi?
It's, you know what, I'd been to Israel many times before, but we'd never been to the West Bank. And in 2004, it was just at the end of the Second Intifada, and I'd got a place in a yeshiva, a sort of a rabbinical seminary to study rabbinics in the West Bank. And both my wife and I were very nervous about coming here because we'd seen BBC reports of American Jews with big white yarmulkes on their heads screaming, "Kill the Arabs," from their caravans. And that's what we assumed. And then we turned up in Efrat, which you know very well, is more like a leafy suburb of London probably than a bunch of caravans. And found our neighbours are very moderate, some even left-wing, strangely enough. And it's a beautiful place to live with wonderful people. And so initially we planned to live in Jerusalem and commute. And once we arrived here and we saw what there was, we just said that we have to live here. So that's where I live now.
Yeah, well, now on the 7th of April 2023, tragedy struck you and your family. Tell us what happened.
So it was the Passover holidays, and it was a Friday morning. We were driving up from Efrat to Tiberias for our holiday, and we're in two cars. Lucy was with my daughter Maya, who was 20, and my daughter Rina, who was 15. I was with my daughter Tali and my son Yehuda, and our fifth child Keren was in Jerusalem for the weekend and was going to join us afterwards. Waze took us up the 90 highway through the Jordan Valley. It wanted us to take a left to bypass some traffic. I continued straight, and Lucy took a left. She encountered two Hamas terrorists, and we buried my daughters on the Sunday and my wife on the Tuesday after she donated her organs and saved 5 lives.
Wow. She must be really proud of the fact that she actually saved lives with an organ donation.
You know what? It was something which we never really thought about. I mean, we discussed it. We didn't have a donor card, but both of us had agreed we would be happy to donate if it was appropriate. And once we did it, the kids and I agreed that we would do it. We thought that would be it. And, so one of those altruistic acts that doesn't have any implication to you afterwards. But actually what happened was about 2 weeks later, we were invited to meet the recipients of the organs. Wow. And there was a big press conference at the Tel Aviv hospital, Beilinson. And the ability to meet these people who were alive because of a decision that we'd made 2 weeks earlier was really very, very comforting to us. And since then, I've been in touch with them. I've been invited to a wedding of one of them, was a 20-year-old boy who's since got married. And there is something very moving about that. On top of that, there was a photograph taken of my daughters, Tali and Karen, listening to the heart of their mother in the chest of the heart recipient, Rina Liat. And that picture went viral on social media. The Daily Mail picked it up, made an article about it, went on their website, which is seen by 350 million people. And we know that it's had a big impact in terms of encouraging organ donation around the world. So I think it's very comforting for us to know that something positive came out of that.
When your wife's car was attacked, was it the only car that was attacked in the area?
It was the only car that was attacked. It was unusual. I mean, I don't think of any other attack like it in the last 20, 30 years. It was obviously a complete shock to us and to the whole nation. It was, at the time, everybody in Israel knew about it and many people around the world because it was so unlikely and such a surprise attack. So whilst, it was a terrible tragedy, one of my messages when I travel abroad is actually about Jews coming home. And I say, despite the fact that, I don't look like a very good advocate for that, our attack was 1 in 10 million. And, I'm not, the reason that people know about it is because it was so unusual. If it happened every day, like it does in many countries, if people get stabbed in the streets of New York and London every day, it wouldn't be a story. But because it was actually so unusual, that was what made it a story.
What happened to the terrorists that did this terrible attack?
So strange thing that happens in Israel is that the generals and all the military come and visit you at the Shiva, which is the 7 days of mourning after the tragedy. And they really ask for forgiveness, or I don't really understand it. I think that's the approach, that they feel that they should have protected you, so you get the high brass coming along. And they said, don't worry, we'll catch the terrorists. I said, look, from my perspective, obviously, if they're dangerous, you have to take them out, fine. I don't personally care. It's not going to change my life whether you do or you don't. And the most important thing is I don't want any Jewish soldier to be injured or killed, God forbid, in that process, because that would make me feel particularly guilty. And, from my perspective, it's not worth it. So they said, don't worry, we'll do it, and we'll do it carefully. Anyway, what happened was 3 weeks after the tragedy, they actually had cameras on the house of the terrorists, and they saw they were preparing for the next attack. So they sent 200 18-year-old boys, many of whom were sons of neighbors of mine here in Efrat, in the army, to surround the house. They sent in a drone and an attack dog, and they actually killed 3 terrorists without any civilian casualties. And thank God no soldier was harmed. But the dog was killed in the process. So in the end, basically, it was a successful attack. But they literally put 200 lives at risk in order to get these guys.
Now, you were in the car behind your wife. Do you feel that God spared your life at all because you were in the car behind?
You know what? I look at it differently. I mean, I think that one of the questions people asked me after the tragedy was, what if? What if we had, left half an hour later? And what if we'd been in the first car and the second car? What if we'd not sold our 7-seater car and traveled in one car? There are many different what ifs that one can ask.
Yeah.
And, every question was very painful, but not as painful as you imagine, because every question people asked me, I'd already thought of myself 1,000 times. But after a while, I realized that asking what if is not a productive process, because whatever happens in our lives, one thing happens. And infinite number of things could have happened. And therefore, to question what might have happened is really not a productive process. But I said, there's one what if you have to ask. What if God planned it this way? That's the only what if. What if from the beginning of creation, it was always going to be the case that I was going to be married to Lucy for 25 years and then I was not? What if I was always going to be the father of 5 kids until the 7th of October 23, and then the father of 3 kids? That what if, I think, is worth considering, because God has a plan, and our question should not be why he has that plan, because we probably won't answer that, but what is my role given what how the plan is acting out in my life.
Now, from this tragedy event, you've actually managed to write a book, 7 Facets of Healing. Was that actually a healing for you, just writing this book?
Yeah, to be honest, it came about because of the ideas that were just washing around in I've written a few books, actually, and what happens is, I have a lot of things that are washing around in my head. I talk about them. I'm a public speaker. I speak around the world in Christian communities, also in Jewish communities. And then every so often I think, I've got the idea. I may as well just write it down. So it's more of a brain dump of something that's been, washing around in my mind and has been useful to me. So these are practical tips to people who are suffering trauma, and it doesn't have to be, the trauma that I had. It can be any type of bereavement. People lose jobs, get divorced, all that type of thing. So how do you deal with crises? And I learned a lot, obviously, through the crisis, which I went through.
Tell us a bit about what the book is actually about. What do you go through in the book?
So look, I found after the tragedy, I think a lot of people feel this. There are a lot of triggers. In other words, everything in your life becomes a trigger. Yes, your best friend turns up, and he's a trigger. Your family, you're chatting to your daughter, she's a trigger. She makes you think of the other daughters. Your friend makes you think about times you spent with them before with the family. You go to a restaurant that you went to before. That's a trigger. You go for your morning walk where you went with your wife and she's not there with you. That's another trigger. So everything becomes a source of pain. What I found was that over time, it's not that the pain goes away. It's just that I was able to work out what was triggering me. And the moment you can figure out what's triggering with you, you can start dealing with it. At the beginning, it's just a mess because it's everything. And then over time, what happens is you can specify in certain situations what it is that's actually causing you grief. And when that happens, you can start dealing with it. And there are 7 categories that we talk about in the book, based on actually categories that Lucy used to use for our date nights. We used to talk about, we used to have to answer a date night question about how our week was going. We'd answer it on 7 categories. She was very organized. We'd talk about friends and family and fun and fitness, function, which is our job, finance, and faith. So there's 7 Fs. And I realized actually those categories are pretty useful for working out the triggers. So that was really what I did. The other thing which was maybe interesting to a Christian audience, I know Christians talk about the Satan. We have a different term. We call it the evil inclination, but it's the same idea. The Satan does not want you to heal. That is a fact, because it would be very easy after something happens to any of us, and things are always happening to us, to say, okay, I don't want to get out of bed. I'm going to lie in bed. I'm not going to get up. I don't have to speak to anybody. I don't have to deal with anything. I don't have to answer any questions. And I can just lie here. I don't have to go to work. People will understand if I don't go to work. I don't have to take my kids out. I don't have to speak to my friends. And I can just basically, decay. I don't have to do any my morning walk and my fitness routine. I can eat chocolate. I can do what I like, because basically I'm totally justified in this situation to do what I like. Now, that is what the Satan is telling you. Now, if you do that, you end up in a spiral of depression and you fall into a pit. And it's very difficult to get out of it. And what I realized was that actually everything that I had to do after the trauma was the opposite of what I wanted to do. And this was very interesting for me, because my life has been very instinctive. And everything I've done in my life so far has been, I feel I need to do this, I've done that, and I would follow my instincts. The moment the trauma struck, I realized all my instincts were 180 degrees wrong. They were telling me to do exactly the opposite thing. And the moment I started fighting my instinct, that was when things picked up for me.
Was this a challenge to your faith?
I don't think so. You know what? I look at it differently. I think that if I had any questions about God, then I would have had them in the past. And I would have said, that if there's no God, then life has no point. In which case, who cares when tragedies happen? Because frankly, our life is meaningless. We're just a spark of stardust in a huge, meaningless universe, and it doesn't matter. And if I felt that, I would have been so depressed beforehand. It wouldn't make any difference if a tragedy happened or not, because frankly, so I think the reason that, people are not really atheists. People who say they're atheists are not atheists. If they really were atheists, they'd be so depressed and they wouldn't get out of bed. So maybe there's some atheists who, don't get out of bed. We never meet them. But the ones you meet, they got out of bed today, so they believe there's some purpose, some reason they're doing it. They probably haven't figured out what God is, but they believe in something. So I think that actually faith is what gets you through these things, and it's even more important, if I can say that, after a tragedy. A friend of mine, a rabbi from Goldberg in Florida, says faith is a muscle. Says if you use it when times are good, it will be there for you when times are bad. But if you don't exercise it when times are good, then it won't be. So in other words, when good things happen to us, we have to say, thank God. And if you don't do that, and you say, I was really lucky, or I did a great job, or I worked hard, you account it on yourself. That means when things go bad, it's all your fault. But the moment you understand that every goodness you have in life comes from God, that means that also every challenge also is coming from him as well. And then you can put it in a box.
Now, your family disaster happened 4 months before October the 7th. And now many families are grieving in Israel. Is your book very timely for the nation of Israel?
Yeah, it was actually 6 months before, so it was April to October. It was exactly 6 months before. Yes, that's why I wrote it, really. I wrote it to help other families. It's translated into Hebrew, and I hope that other families who are going through this will read it and get some strength.
Did you actually lose friends after this tragedy? Sometimes people have said, someone's been a friend with the wife, so then you're the husband, and you don't see them anymore. Did you see how people treated you different after this?
Interesting question. I'll tell you something. I think because it was so public, first of all, We had 10,000 people come to the Shiva and to the funeral, mostly strangers. I walked in the street afterwards. People gave me a hug. Random strangers would come to give me a hug. Neighbors of mine who were not so friendly with before the tragedy stepped in and looked after me and the kids for months after the tragedy. A few close friends distanced themselves. And I noticed that phenomenon, and I don't blame them. And they still distance themselves, I think, because for them it's very painful to come to the house or to speak to me or whatever, and it makes them remember Lucy and the kids. But generally speaking, the opposite. I found people, came and have a whole new crowd of friends who have really embraced us.
Is there hope at the end of the tunnel after such tragic loss?
I think that if you look at, I look at Jewish history, I think probably world history very similar, but Jewish history is based on tragedy that is always followed by redemption. We see this in the Bible, that the Jewish people are slaves in Egypt, and then God sort of appears to them on Mount Sinai 7 weeks after they leave, and this is the height of human existence. And we saw this after the Holocaust. 3 years after the Holocaust, the State of Israel was declared in 1948. We saw this in 1967 when the BBC was predicting a second Holocaust. And 6 days after the war started, we ended up taking back Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. So this is the pattern of life, that often great redemption comes after tragedy. And I think, October the 7th is a good example of that. A terrible tragedy. But 3 years later, we're in such a better position than we were before, because we have control over most of our enemies, and who knows how this Iranian situation will end up, but hopefully we'll end up in a much more peaceful situation going forwards.
Have you been able to minister to other victims of terror?
So I try to go to their shivas and to meet with them as much as I can, probably not as much as I should. But people came to my shiva. I can remember half a dozen at least who came and gave me tremendous comfort. In fact, there's one guy who was incredible, a guy called Yaniv, who he goes to a lot of these terror victims' shivas. And his message is beautiful. I think it's probably what he said to me. It's that, you think your life is destroyed. And that is obviously the first thought when this happens. But he said, I'm a father. He said he lost his wife and his kids as well, actually in a car crash. But he said, I'm a father and I'm a husband, but I'm also a son, and I'm a brother, and I'm a friend, and I'm a community member, and I'm a human being. And and so he said, and yes, with the tragedy, he said, I, lost my wife, I lost my kids. I'm no longer a father, I'm no longer a husband, but I'm still a human being. I'm still a friend. I'm still a brother. I'm still a son. I'm still a nephew, and I'm still a human being. And so those parts of my being have not been changed. And it's a strange thing to say. Maybe it sounds a bit flippant, but I thought it was actually a beautiful way of describing the phenomenon that, parts of your self-identity are destroyed, but parts are really not left untouched. And this is an incredible way of looking at it, I think.
How has this changed your life?
I quit my job. I was teaching maths at the time, and I became a speaker who goes around the world, around Israel, talking about hope and talking about healing. I also talk about, in America and around the world, I talk about Aliyah, Jews coming home. And I've written a few books. So I think my life has gone off in a tangent. I think what happens to people when they go through tragedy is they need to find meaning. I couldn't continue doing what I was doing before because, it had no meaning in my new world. I had to find something that made sense of my suffering. And in a sense, it's not so that I'm using my suffering as a platform, but I'm asking myself the question, why did this happen to me? Or what can I do with what happened to me? How can I use this for the betterment of society or for people's lives, whatever? So, I think that's the question people ask. I think if you can do that after a trauma, you can find something meaningful, then it can really, it's in my book, it's one of the methods of healing under sort of function.
So God has actually used this, the terrible tragedy that you've gone through, so that you can actually now make a difference in other people's lives and bring comfort to other people.
I think so. That's how you have to look at it. I mean, I was asked, actually, I said this at McGill University a few months ago. I was in Canada, and one of the students put up his hand a bit cheeky, and he said, "Did you always believe this, or is it just convenient to believe this now that that you've been through this?" And meaning that, did you always believe God was in charge and that there's meaning in life and whatever, or do you just make this up basically because it helps you get through the tragedy? And I said to him, you know what? I said, you're at McGill University. I said, you study long hours, 12 hours a day, doing your exams, studying things, whatever, working really hard, because you believe that you'll get a good job at the end of it, and having a good job is meaningful to you, and getting lots of money and having a big house, whatever you want to think. I said, is that true? Is it true that that is the purpose of life, is to, have a good job and earn lots of money and live in a nice neighborhood in Montreal? Or, is that just what you tell yourself because it's convenient to you in order to, get through this phase of your life? So I think he understood the message, which is that, what we believe is very much bound up with what works for us. I think people who believe things which are harmful, of which there are people, that's not healthy. And it's probably not true. I think if, as far as humans can ascertain, when you believe something that is helpful to you, then it probably is true, certainly to you. And, it's meaningful. So I don't know if that answers the question.
What is your prayer for those who are going through difficulties now, today?
My prayer is that they have the strength to pull through and not to give up, because I think it's very easy to give up to the Satan and to just, fall into bad habits, lie in bed, and then it's sort of like a cycle. I think they need to have this prayer is that they'll have friends also who will help them out of it. And I have to say, one of the things, again, in my book I talk about is that I live in an incredible community, but there are many great communities around the world. It happens to be that in my community, people knew to say to me, they didn't say to me, Leo, call me when you're feeling up to it and let's, I'll come around for a chat or whatever. They said, Leo, I am coming around at 5 o'clock on Monday. And then they said, I'm coming around 5 o'clock every Monday until you say stop. And I had somebody on Tuesday at 3 o'clock and someone on Wednesday. I have today, 3 years later, I meet with people every day, different time slots. The same people have been coming week in, week out, and we learn together, or we walk together, or we chat together. And that's a huge part of my healing. But it's because people basically organize my life. I think that one of the problems with trauma is that people expect you to sort of contact them and get in touch with them, but you don't do that, because after trauma, you stop organizing. And if you want to be a good friend to someone in trauma, the best thing you can do is organize their life. Come around and just be there for them. Don't ask them, never ask their opinion, just be there. And that was one of the great things that I learned.
Your book is called The 7 Facets of Healing. Where can people get a hold of this book?
It's available on Amazon.
Well, Rabbi Leo, thank you so much for sharing today.
Thank you, Paul, and all the best.
Thank you for joining us today. Pray that God will move by his mighty power in the Holy Land and bring his peace.